Hello guys and welcome back for part 3 of the RPGs I've played in 2025. Part 1 and part 2 will be in the description. The 28th game I played was Trails in the Sky First Chapter, played on PC and it took 45 hours to finish. I've played Sky FC 3 times before, but with a very special game releasing in September, it only made sense to play through the original one more time. Even 4 playthroughs later, being aware of most of the story developments and knowing where a fair number of the secrets were, it's still a great game to play. Sky FC in many ways is a JRPG comfort food, a typical adventure style game as Estelle and Joshua travel around the kingdom of La Burle in their quest to become fully fledged bracers. The turn-based combat is great, the writing is excellent, but what really struck me after playing all the Trails games so far is how much groundwork Sky FC lays for the future of the series. Everything seen in the series to date begun here, and it just shows to me that Falcom always had a clear direction for the series when they begun it back in 2004. Sure, the remake is coming out soon, but that doesn't mean it will replace the original. I think both of them will coexist together with their own unique charms. The 29th game I played was Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, GameCube emulated, and it took me 31 hours to finish. It took over 15 years, but I finally got around to the second Tellius game. Unlike many, I played these classics in reverse. Starting with Radiant Dawn back in my teen years, it was Radiant Dawn that put the name of Fire Emblem in my head. And then from there I would pick up games like Fire Emblem Awakening when they eventually released too. Path of Radiance on the other hand is a game that eluded me for years despite my desire to play it, but come 2025 it's now another game ticked off the list. And it was totally worth it. Being the first game in the Tellius duology, we join a young Ike as he trains to one day take over the Graal Mercenaries, a group led by his father. Eventually, Ike has to take up that mantle in order to help the usurped Princess Alincia to retake the Crimean throne after her home is invaded by the neighbouring kingdom of Dane. As for the plot, it's Fire Emblem through and through, warring kingdoms with elements of fantasy. Yet despite its common approach, Path of Radiance has a good story. It's well told, and I enjoyed the eventual reconciliation between the Beorc and Laguz, how that slowly comes to the fore. It becomes one of the main themes of the game. Path of Radiance has everything I'd want in a fantasy story of this kind. It's got politics, betrayal, a central antagonist, and for me it only gets better when considering its direct sequel. Already knowing what happens in Radiant Dawn, which occurs 3 years after Path of Radiance, it takes a good story and elevates it into a great story when combined together. It's quite clear to me that come the end of Path of Radiance they always intended to make a sequel. There are a few plot threads that are left open, but it's still a satisfying story as a standalone. I also have to echo that sentiment for the characters. Path of Radiance brought some notable features into the franchise for the first time that are still utilised till this day, and they only make the characters better. For one, the idea of a base in between battles where you can prepare equipment and also listen to side events and interactions between characters. Until this game, most Fire Emblems saw characters interact in battle, which, if you think about it, isn't ideal. I much prefer the idea of relaxing at home base and then having these conversations between members. It feels more realistic, and as is the case with modern Fire Emblem, these interactions are a highlight, only adding more depth and relatability to the extremely large collection of characters. And that is no exaggeration, there are a lot of optional recruitable characters, some appearing at the base as a side event and others appearing in battle. The only way to recruit many of them is to talk using a certain unit, often one who has a relationship to the target. And of course, permadeath is prominent in this game. While some simply retreat due to their plot importance, there are also a fair number who will be killed outright if you're not careful, which needless to say is something I try to avoid. One thing I do appreciate massively however, and is something I want to highlight, is that raising affinity between units for the conversations doesn't require units to be adjacent to each other. They simply need to participate in the same battle. I wish more games would do that. Now as for the gameplay, it is the obvious highlight of Path of Radiance. When you think of Fire Emblem, you often think of strategic combat with weapons triangles, terrain advantages, and a bunch of different roles like mages, wyvern riders, and archers. Path of Radiance is basically just that. It's a Fire Emblem game through and through. You have your weapons triangles, which also applies to magic too. The map designs are good, there's nothing cheap like in Shadows of Valentia, like the dreaded swamps or narrow hallways that force you to funnel with infinitely rift-spawning enemies. Each unit has limited inventory space, many weapons have durability, and units can change into a more advanced class when they hit a certain level or use a mastery seal. And you know what? It's fun, as it always is. Fire Emblem doesn't fail in terms of gameplay, it never does. Sure, there are lesser Fire Emblem games, but they're all fun, and if you like what one game offers, you'll mostly appreciate what the others do too. It leads to a rigid but enjoyable gameplay loop. You do a battle, go to base, prepare for the next one, listen to support conversations, see some side events, and then move on to the next battle. It's a very delicate balance that I think Path of Radiance nails. In addition, Path of Radiance also brings back unit skills which were first introduced in Genealogy of the Holy War. All units have a certain number of points and each skill has a point value assigned to it. So for example, a unit who has 25 points maximum can equip a total of 25 points worth of skills, and many of them are well worth picking up. They range from taking the initiative in battles to straight up unique skills for certain units like Ike's Ether ability, so there's real incentive to find them, often in the treasure chests that are scattered around during battle. I also appreciate that Path of Radiance has a bonus experience pool. Every time you finish a fight you get a reward of bonus experience depending on your performance, and then those points can be applied back at base to any unit of your choosing. It ensures that even the characters who naturally don't get much experience, like healers or naturally weaker members, can at least be kept up to parity with the rest of the army. It's only a good thing to me. Sure, you could potentially break the game by dumping it all into one unit, but Path of Radiance demands a balanced approach, I feel, if you want to make sure all the characters survive till the end. Granted, there were a couple of issues I had with it, but nothing major. For one, there's a mechanic called biorhythm, which apparently reflects the mood of the character, and it fluctuates on every turn. It's shown on the character's status screen as a sine wave, and it's also visible next to their portrait. Depending on that state, it will affect their hit and dodge parameters, but I didn't even notice its existence. I only realised it was there about an hour into the game when I was scrolling through a character's status screen. Also, inventory management can be a bit annoying, but it's a large group of characters, so I sort of expected a bit of frustration here anyway. And to be honest, I've seen worse. I got used to navigation of the menus by chapter 10, so that's minor as well. All in all, I am happy I finally got to play Path of Radiance. It means that I now know the full story of the Tellius games, even if I saw it in reverse. For me personally, these two games are the best of Fire Emblem that I've played to date, expressing everything that is good about the series while also doing better in the areas it often struggles in. And now, if you own a Switch too, you can play it digitally via the online library, which has Path of Radiance as one of the games in the collection. Granted, you gotta pay a membership fee, but it's a far cry from the £200 you need to fork up for a physical version, not to mention the fee for a GameCube as well. If you have the means, it's worth checking out. The 30th game I played was the remastered Lunar SSS story, played on PC, and it took 24 hours to finish. Wow. Just wow. That's all I could say as the credits rolled on Silver Star Story. It's an excellent game, and I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. For reference, the original version of this game on the Sega CD came out before I was born, mid-1992, and over 30 years later it still holds up. Of course, being a remaster, there have been some improvements, but in reality there's not much that has been added. It's been upscaled, you can choose to play with the classic or remastered modes, there was a newly recorded English dub, a more faithful script, and the option to speed up battles. But that was pretty much it, not even an autosave feature. The truth is though, Lunar never needed much to be added because its underlying quality is so good. I saw Lunar as a safe JRPG. It was probably quite ambitious when it first came out utilising CD technology, but nowadays it doesn't do anything you haven't seen if you're a fan of the genre. But what it does have is consistent quality throughout. There wasn't an outright drawback with the game itself, it's just a very good JRPG, and that still rings true even now. Silver Star's story is centered around the journey of Alex, who sets out to become the Dragon Master by passing trials set on him by the 4 dragons of the world. This story quickly shifts to your typical world-saving affair. It is a straightforward story, akin to a Dragon Quest game in some respects. A chosen hero must travel across the land and gain the favour of demi-god-like beings and save the world with that power. It's not complex, but straightforward stories do work. and it certainly does for Lunar. While it isn't thematically deep, it is engaging and it is enjoyable with very good pacing. Where Alex and the party are given ample time in each area before moving on, the balance feels just right in terms of its narrative flow. It's a simple fantasy story, but it is told well. And no doubt what aids it are the beautiful animated cutscenes in combination with its stellar musical score. Upscaled for the remaster, they look so good. I am a sucker for anime cutscenes in a JRPG admittedly, but when they're a core part of the visual storytelling of the game, I can't help but be drawn in. I was exactly the same with Ni no Kuni. I think combining anime and JRPG is a match made in heaven. I love when games go down that angle, and Silver Star Story is one of the best. They happen frequently, the animation is gorgeous, and they positively add so much to the story. Characters are much the same, I liked all of them. It's an endearing group of characters who each get plenty of moments to shine and demonstrate their motivations, and each of them develops quite well over the relatively short runtime. The dialogue is great and brings the personality of each character to life, not too serious as well, with a decent amount of humour sprinkled in. Yeah, nothing bad to say on that front. Gameplay wise, Lunar is linear. It has an overworld map with towns and villages spread across the land, but I never found myself lost in the game. In fact, it was impossible to get lost. Certain areas will be closed off before you proceed the story to a certain point, so it's pretty much a case of moving from point to point and letting the story play out. But linear progression is fine. There is nothing wrong with that. Linear progression, where you move from story event to story event, has always been a common element of JRPGs, and I've never had an issue with that. Linear level design is where I draw the line. Games like Final Fantasy XIII, for instance, has this aspect where you just run forward without any divergence to towns or talking to NPCs, so the gameplay loop becomes stagnant and it has very little incentive to explore. Lunar, thankfully, does not fall into that category. There are plenty of optional events to seek out, and they're often worth it as well. Combat is a turn-based affair, up to 5 characters at a time, and it uses a straightforward layout, it has to be said. Each character can attack, guard, run away, use items, and has a set of unique skills, learning more as they level up. There is the odd moment where you might need to spread characters out to avoid AoE attacks, which is why I would have preferred an option to move as a separate command, but all in all, it's a good battle system. Nothing grand, but nothing that really holds it back either. And as long as you're battling often, you won't need to grind on many occasions. Its actual gameplay pacing is really good. I felt the challenge of the game was just right. There were odd walls of difficulty here and there, mostly tied to the bosses, but there was nothing that felt cheap mechanically. It can be difficult at times, but that's fine. Challenge is a good thing, as long as it's fair. I'd say there was only one time where I felt the game screwed me over, and that was quite early on fighting the water dragon, as I didn't have enough consumables to take him out. I learned very quickly that I had to stock up on a lot of consumables throughout the game, particularly the items that raised MP. And I also learned quickly to save often. Going back to that water dragon, when I inevitably bit the dust, I was astounded to not see a retry option or an autosave slot for this remaster. This is all manual, and up till that fight I hadn't saved for nearly 30 minutes. Again, lesson learnt, save frequently. And it isn't too difficult to do. You press the Y button on an Xbox controller and it brings up the save menu, so it's not exactly water off the back. I'd say the biggest issue I had with the game was the inventory management, mainly due to visuals. For me, this game would have greatly benefited from a shaded box in the background as you shopped to allow the items to pop more vividly. Having them put against the graphics of the game just made them feel like a mess, so I'd say that's where I wasn't too keen. But that's it. And as you might have deduced by the commentary, I had a great time with the first Lunar. Silver Star Story, for a game that released in 1992 originally, pretty much has it all for a JRPG fan. Great story, enjoyable turn-based combat, the beautiful animated cutscenes, fantastic music, the charming cast of characters, and very few areas where it falters. It's a great game that stays consistently great throughout its runtime, and that is something a lot of RPGs struggle to do. The 31st game I played was the 100-line Last Defense Academy, played on PC, and it took 120 hours to finish. Right, here it is. This was another game on my most anticipated list, Godaka and Uchikoshi as directors, highly ambitious, great premise, and a demo that drew me in. Most of what I mentioned in terms of gameplay has already been touched on in my demo impressions video for the game, so I won't be going too much in depth on that. I'll just give a TLDR on what the basic premise of Last Defense Academy is, along with its gameplay loop. Takumi Sumino, a resident of the Tokyo residential district, is living a boring, mundane life until the day invaders attack. Takumi uses the power of Himo Anima to draw on special powers to fight back before he eventually passes out. When he wakes up, he finds himself with a group of others at the Last Defense Academy, which he must now defend from invader attacks for 100 days. This encompasses living out that 100-day period as the story progresses, with the odd strategic battle and exploration sections sprinkled in. Now, the demo impressions were good, and I did believe I would enjoy the game when it had its full release. I held back judgments on the story, which I imagine was going to be the focus of the game anyway, as quite simply you can't judge a story on 3 hours of demo gameplay. Now, 120 hours later, I can say that I did like this game. There were a lot of good points, but at the same time, there were many points where it frustrated me too. There is a blanket term that is so often used in every walk of life. This isn't for everyone. I try to mostly steer away from using it because it goes without saying that not every game will be for every player. One person's gold is another person's fetid mess. However, for me, the term in of itself was made because of games like Last Defense Academy. I simply cannot recommend this game to everyone. It will appeal to a very specific niche of player, mostly those who like the focus on story, but even then it can flatter to deceive. So why is that the case? It all comes down to the ambition and scope of the game, and we'll be diving into the story elements here, not spoilers specifically, but the structure of the game itself during this commentary. So if you consider that a spoiler, you can move on. So the big draw of 100-line Last Defense Academy is that it was a hybrid visual novel with tactical gameplay and, of course, visual novel elements that boasted 100 different endings, which become available once you've completed the common routes, which are your first 100 days. From there, the game starts to split off. And Kodaka wasn't joking, there are 100 different endings. I got them all. And from watching this interview from Kodaka and Uchikoshi, you can understand why some were expecting them to be wholly unique.
100通りのエンディングを、全て、どのルートも、新エンドにトゥルーエンドになってもいいというような感じで作ってほしいという要望だったので、それぞれのエンディングが、本当に、新ルートというか、と言ってもいいぐらい面白い作りになっているので、その中から、プレイヤーの皆さんがおそらく、どのルートか必ず、気に入っていただけるエンディングがあると思うので、それを、新ルートとか新エンドとみなしていただければなと思っています。
So it comes straight from their mouths there. The idea is that each ending could be the true ending. However, after playing it, their words ring hollow for me because they basically go against what they said in that interview. A lot of the endings are not endings in the truest sense. Many of them are just small divergences at the very end which lead to either a good or bad end, so you get branches that look like this, with each green section representing an ending. As such, a fair handful of them can feel like a letdown and can drain motivation to see through the rest. To put this statement into perspective, once I realised how big the game actually was upon finishing the common route, I had to play Last Defense Academy alongside a different game. Playing this day by day would just not work out for me. So what was happening is that I'd play Last Defense Academy for a few days, finish up a couple of endings, and then move on to another game for the next few days. In some cases, it might even be up to a week until I revisited. It worked well though. That balance was very important to get me through all 100 endings, because by the time I finished this, I had also completed 7 other games that I played alongside it. That should give you an idea as to how much is in the game. And not all of it was positive, because many of the endings, like I say, were just nothing. I can't judge the endings of this game simply because a lot of them are dead ends. In reality, it's not the quality of the endings that need to be considered, it's the quality of the routes. There are about 20 different routes in this game, and from there you get like 5 divergences for each of them. Each of those routes has what you would call an optimal ending, and they basically cover every genre you can think of. You've got murder routes, comedy routes, romance routes, it's all there. And with that, you could argue that there is an ending for everyone. That was the supposed aim of Kodaka and his team. They wanted to create a game where any player who tries Last Defense Academy will find an ending for them, where every conclusion could be seen as the true one. I am not sold on that statement, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But coming back to that structure, you have a bunch of different routes, and the choices you make steer you down those paths. There is no doubt that the game is ambitious, and for some, that is enough to love it. The fact that it goes that extra mile, that it is a massive game with hours of content, but I've always maintained this. Ambition without restraint is only a detriment. It's one thing stating you want to do something, it's another to actually make it happen. For me, Last Defense Academy steers a little bit too much into quantity over quality. The idea of having 100 different endings sounded great on paper, but in execution it leads to a mishmash of caliber. Yeah, it's understandable that if you have so many different routes, some will naturally be better than others, but I feel that Last Defense Academy has too many duds with some big inconsistencies between them. Like for instance, in some routes, characters can't be revived because they lost too much blood, but in others they literally are blown to pieces but can still revive. It makes no sense. By the end, I felt this game would have been much better if they simply cut the 100-day timer in half, make it the 50-day Last Defense Academy, and chop off some of the meaningless endings too, because in many cases you would wake up for a day only for it to pass over because Takumi was tired or Takumi was too depressed and didn't want to get out of bed. Some may argue that stuff like that should be in the game to aid the storytelling, but not for me. If I were to split the quality of the routes, I'd say 20% are great, 40% are good, 25% were forgettable, and the remaining 15% are god-awful. And the ultimate experience you have with the game pretty much comes down to a roll of the dice. Which ones do you bump into first? There's not really any flow or congruent storytelling that hints at the routes you might eventually fall into. For example, choosing to dodge an attack eventually leads you to a comedy route that comes out of nowhere, whereas if you chose to counter-attack, it leads to a more fitting route. There's no rhyme or reason to how some of these choices affect the end result. And like I say, the experience you have will ultimately depend on what routes you encounter early on. Sure, you can jump to other routes if it's not grabbing you, but chances are you would have invested a fair amount of time into that route before you realised that it's actual hogwash, which could sour your impression of the entire game anyway. I happened to bump into one of these routes early on. I had 15 endings by this point and then eventually fell into, I'm going to say it here because it is straight up garbage, the serial battles route. This was absolute crap. Literally battle after battle every 2 days or so from around day 30, and because I hit it quite early on in my playthrough, I didn't have the option to skip the battles. I had to do every one of them. By day 70, I called it quits. I went to another route, and once I had about 40 more endings under my belt, I came back to this one and thankfully could skip every battle except the last one, and it was still tedious. This is the issue. The quality discrepancy between routes is vast. Some are brilliant, while others made me want to pull my hair out with a pair of salad tongs. And the game itself doesn't help in that respect. It was lacking in some real important areas of quality of life in its vanilla release, which admittedly some have been updated during my own playthrough. But these were the ones that grinded my gears. For one, when you want to make a decision, it would give you a choice whether you wanted to go to the beginning of the day or before the decision. However, if you chose the second option, you'd still have to watch the scenes beforehand and even in some cases go through a battle again to get to that branch. You could say it's to add context to your choice if you haven't seen it in a while, but if you wanted context, you just start from the beginning of the day anyway. And it was changed. An update made it so that you went straight to the choice itself. Good. Another one is that exploration missions were mandatory at one point, and you couldn't even use the checkpoints you had found prior. So every time the story required it, you had to jog all the way to your destination using the school as the starting point, which became tedious as well and led to another horrible route which was centered on exploration missions. This was also updated. Later on in my playthrough, I was able to skip all of these segments. The biggest problem, no doubt, though, was repetition, and was made perfectly clear by the lack of a very important feature that every visual novel should have: the ability to skip over text that you have already read. Last Defense Academy has a skip option, but it skips over everything, so it's worthless in many cases. If you want to see unique dialogue between routes, you have no choice but to just read through it normally, even if 90% of it is the same. That's a big oversight, especially considering how text-heavy the game is. I dared not skip any text, barring the morning announcements, because I simply would never know if I was going over something important for the overall story. And talking about that overall story, like I said prior, Kodaga stated that the idea for Last Defense Academy was that it would have an ending for everyone, that every ending would be considered a true ending, so in short, many of them would be open-ended. There would be situations where not everything is explained. However, I believe that the initial intention for this game was to have all routes contribute to the overall story simply because there are moments where it will lock you off from progression. When I saw these locks, I assumed that it was because there was important information elsewhere that would eventually lead to a canonical ending, where basically most of the plot threads are brought together, similar to a game like Aegis Rim for instance. So I pressed on. I did the other routes, and slowly but surely I got rid of the locks and saved this particular route for last, because all signs pointed to it being the true ending. In reality though, it just left even more questions that were never answered in the other routes either, which leads me to believe there is DLC on the way. When I got that final ending, all I could say was, is that it? There were plot points unanswered, cliffhangers weren't revisited, supposedly important characters never appear in any of the routes and are just referenced via text. I was disappointed, to say the least. It didn't feel like a satisfying payoff, which is what the game was supposedly leading up to. In fact, I would expect a satisfying conclusion from 100 endings worth of story. And for that reason, if someone asked if I'd recommend getting all 100 endings, I'd say no. Instead, I'd check up lists or articles that say which ones to prioritise and just focus on those ones. Like I say, I liked Last Defense Academy. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't have got all 100 endings, but it's a game that is so much more than it needed to be. I can't help but feel it should have been better. It's got too much fluff in it for my liking with inadequate payoff in many cases. No doubt there's a lot of good here in terms of the routes, the characters are mostly good depending on the route itself, the dialogue is decent, playing on familiar terms and references, and the combat is fairly enjoyable if not easy. But this is a case where I feel ambition misguided the game. It misguided it to the point where it steered more into quantity over quality, and as such, it will only appeal to a very specific subset of player. The 32nd game I played was Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth, played on PC, and it took 51 hours to finish. There were two reasons why I prioritised this. One, there is a new Digimon Story game coming out later this year, and two, it was cheap. I purchased this game on the Steam Summerfest for £7, which is a bargain no matter how you slice it. I haven't played any Digimon game to date, so this seemed like the best time to start. And this is the thing, while I like Digimon as a franchise, there wasn't much back in the late 90s to solidify its popularity in the UK, except for the anime. It's a show that back in the day I would watch if it was on, but I wouldn't go out of my way to watch it. For instance, back when it was airing, I would prioritise shows like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Shaman King, DBZ and Beyblade, not to mention some of those had other areas that consolidated their charm. Pokemon had a set of fun and accessible games, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had the card game, Beyblade had the blades, Digimon on the other hand didn't have anything like this, and as such it was a franchise that me and friends knew about, but often put below others. That thought process still remains till this day, and is one reason why I haven't played any of the games, despite there being plenty to choose from. With that in mind, I was going in tentatively to Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth, which to be clear is the complete edition which also has Hacker's Memory, effectively 2 games in one as a package. And 51 hours later, I was surprised in how much I enjoyed the game. It felt a bit rough in places, but its core gameplay was solid. I had a good time with it. Though, my playthrough almost ended before it begun because of the terrible PC port. Easily one of the worst I've seen in recent years. To even start the game, I had to create a new user file on Windows, and it would also crash unless I disabled certain graphics settings like threaded optimization, not to mention performance was inconsistent with frequent frame drops. I made a point that Atelier Yumiya's PC port was shaky. This one is worse. And that's unfortunate. I hate when a good game is held back by technical issues, and Cyber Sleuth is undoubtedly a good game. It takes place in Tokyo, where the self-insert protag has the ability to jump into cyberspace, and as such is taken on as an assistant by a local detective Kyoko, giving him the title Cyber Sleuth. The protag takes on a variety of cases, one at a time, and they range from finding missing items to helping clients with certain issues. The real draw though is that the Cyber Sleuth not only helps the people of Tokyo, he also assists the digital programs within cyberspace known as Digimon. This relationship between the real and digital world becomes a core narrative focus of the game, as it so often was from the shows. I have to say, the story was pretty good. There were a few points where it dragged, but for the most part, I liked the mystery tied to it and the later developments too, along with the characters, which for the most part are decent. I did have some issues with the dialogue, which either had grammatical errors or felt a bit wooden at times, but nothing overbearing for the experience as a whole. That mostly positive moniker also applies to the quality of the cases themselves. I'd say most of them are fun to see through, while others, like finding lost items, can be a drag. And they drag because they often require you to revisit old dungeons. The dungeons for me are easily the weakest part of the game, and you'll be visiting them a lot. I've made clear before that I'm not too fond of dungeon crawlers, and Cyber Sleuth reaffirms my stance. They're mostly corridors with branching paths and some tedious puzzles breaking them up. I'm talking about the ones that have you backtrack the entire way to flip a switch. They're not challenging, they're just there to pad the experience out. Now at least later on you can use specific overworld skills to avoid encounters altogether. But here's the thing, Cyber Sleuth never needed padding. The playtime naturally balloons because the actual gameplay is addictive as hell. The protag can use a digital capture device which basically allows them to assemble a team of Digimon, up to 11 in an active party, with a much larger bank in reserve that is available too, and all these Digimon can digivolve into a range of different forms, starting at training and going all the way up to their mega evolutions. To ensure you don't break the game, however, the party is limited by a cap, with each Digimon having a memory value assigned to it. The more powerful the form, the higher the memory cost. The memory cap will only increase after finding certain items either through story progression, completing cases, or in chests within the dungeons. But taking a Digimon and getting it to the Mega Stage is merely the tip of the iceberg. The system on offer in Cyber Sleuth is very deep, because quite simply, even if the end goal are Mega Forms, there are higher tier Mega Forms that require specific stat spreads and level caps to digivolve into. For instance, there is a stat called ABI, or Ability. This can only be raised by digivolving or de-digivolving. Not only is a higher ABI required for some of those higher tier Mega Evolutions, it's also the pool by which bonus stats are distributed from. Say for example you wanted to digivolve to a Mega Evolution that required 150 attack, there might be a chance that the Digimon itself would never attain that in its ultimate form, even if they hit the cap of level 99. For example, the max attack stat they might get would be 140. The only way to make up the difference is to use the Digifarms, and then train them to raise the attack stat. And training, in of itself, is determined by aspects like who the leader is on the farm, what the personality is of the Digimon itself, and what items are on the farm when training takes place. If you find that the training hasn't worked as intended though, you can also use an item called Delimiters to remove unwanted bonus stats, and then try again. So the loop often goes that you digivolve and de-digivolve till you get to the required ABI, with each of these resetting the Digimon's level to 1, and keep doing this till you get the required stat spread for the later evolutions you're aiming for. Now I'll admit, that sounds tedious. Having to go back and forth between forms just to raise a specific stat along with re-leveling sounds like a chore, but Cyber Sleuth is tailored around this. There are specific Digimon like Platinum Numemon which provides a significant experience boost as a passive ability. And in addition, the benefit stacks. So if you have 3 of them battling at once, along with equipping them with items that boost that further, you can level up insanely fast. I'm talking level 1 to 99 in about 20 minutes if you find a good grinding spot. And who doesn't enjoy seeing rising numbers as a JRPG fan? This is undoubtedly the best part of the game for me, building a group of Digimon, advancing them to their mega forms, and just building the team to circumvent any battle. It's also worth noting that it can sometimes be worth leveling up a Digimon in a lower form first to acquire specific skills. It's kind of similar to SMT in that regard, where the movesets cross over between forms and slowly become more balanced and naturally stronger over time. I really liked it. And the same holds true for the combat. Turn-based style, you have 3 active Digimon at a time, and you can switch out to your reserve team at the press of a button. Each Digimon has an elemental attribute like fire, water, electric and all that jazz, which have strengths and weaknesses against others, plus each Digimon falls into a class of virus, data or vaccine, which operates like a weapons triangle. Data beats vaccine, vaccine beats virus, and virus beats data. In short, if you hit the elemental weakness and the class weakness at the same time, you'll deal triple the damage. So it pays to have a team that covers all the bases. All the Digimon also have their unique abilities that will look familiar to those who have watched the shows, and they can also chain their abilities together for more damage or to extend buff durations. It's a good battle system, especially when adding in the customization depth that comes from actually building the team in the first place. And that's the thing, I'll admit that I had some issues with Cyber Sleuth. Some of it is tied to the technical issues, the dungeons are quite lame, and some of the cases feel shallow, but the main part of it is great, which is the quest to find Digimon, build a team, and see through a decent story. Even if you're not a fan of Digimon, I still think many JRPG fans would enjoy Cyber Sleuth for what it is. Plus, if you own the complete edition and liked Cyber Sleuth, you can jump straight into Hacker's Memory right after. The 33rd game I played was Mado Monogatari, Fear and the Wondrous Academy, played on Switch, and it took 21 hours to finish. It actually happened. I found a game from Idea Factory that I liked. I have a history of these guys. No matter what game they put out, published or developed, I just can't get on board with it. Neptunia, Agorest, Fairy Fencer, none of them have caught the imagination. But even with that history, I was willing to take a chance on Mado Monogatari, Fear and the Wondrous Academy, a long overdue return to a franchise that begun back in 1990. And you know what? It was pretty good. It's flawed for certain, a lot of repetition in terms of dungeon crawling, but it's a chill game. One that you can turn your brain off for and just have fun with. It's essentially a slice of life JRPG. The story and characters are wacky and never take themselves too seriously. The combat, combining both action and turn-based mechanics, is fun. The visuals are nice, the balance between dungeon crawling and downtime at the academy is optimal, and the progression tied to unlocking new spells is rewarding. It's a solid 7 out of 10 game to me, and is worth picking up at its relatively low asking price. The 34th game I played was Tales of Eternia, PS1 emulated, and it took 32 hours to finish. The full video is available for members and patrons. Tales rarely lets me down, and Eternia was yet another hit for Bamco's action RPG franchise. It had some disappointing omissions like the lack of skits that never made it to the PS1 English release, which is the one I played, and the voice acting is a product of its time, but it does well in most of the other areas I care about. Story is good, characters are great, the pacing of the game is fairly strong over the course of the 3 discs, and it's got lots of optional content to seek out. A consistent series is Tales. The 35th game I played was Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma, played on PC, and it took me 39 hours to finish. Another of my most anticipated releases for 2025, Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma had so much promise. Trailers obviously don't tell a full story, but I liked everything I saw when it was first announced. The farming, the slick action combat, a nice colourful art style, and plenty of relatable characters to build bonds with. And I had a lot of hope placed on this one, since my last visit to Rune Factory was with Rune Factory 4, which I bounced from quite quickly. I'm happy, and in a way relieved to say, that Guardians of Azuma does not suffer that same fate. It was everything I expected it to be, and most of what I wanted it to be. And that was a laid-back, comfortable RPG that made me smile. That's all I wanted from Guardians of Azuma, and it delivered. First of all, the PC port, it's got a decent amount of options available: graphical presets, VSync, uncapped frame rates, anti-aliasing. Pretty much most of what you'd expect in a competent PC port is there. It never crashed, it ran smoothly, I couldn't ask for much more. Now the game begins with a battle between 2 dragons and their riders in the sky, which eventually leads to the protag being smited down to the village below. The protag gets amnesia, which is a very common trope in Rune Factory, and finds that they are known as an Earth Dancer, which is the Eastern equivalent to the Earth Mates from mainline Rune Factory games. As an Earth Dancer, the protag is able to revitalise the lands of Azuma that are currently being drained of runes. This translates into rescuing the deities of 4 villages, while also stopping the main threat that faces Azuma itself, short and sweet. And that's all that can be said about the story. It's fine, good in parts. I do think some of the developments later on suffer from some pacing issues, but the general premise of the game is well focused and it never really steers into anything unexpected. Unexpected developments are fine, but it has to earn it, and thankfully Guardians of Azuma doesn't steer into anything that just makes you scratch your head. It's very much a game that's all about friendship triumphing overall, and really I didn't expect Guardians of Azuma to have a mind-blowing story. I went in expecting it to be competent, and that's exactly what I got. The characters, on the other hand, are much better, once again expectedly so. Rune Factory as a series is known for having relatable and fun characters, and Guardians of Azuma is no exception. There's a huge amount that you meet throughout the journey, and a lot of them have specific side stories that are well told. In order to unlock these, you have to build your bonds with them first, which involves speaking to them often daily, and hanging out with them from a choice of 4 options, and these will expand over time. Each character will have certain activities that they like more, and those will contribute to deepening the bond quicker. It's a bit repetitive, I will say that, but I appreciate there are some unique scenes tied to these characters when you choose an option. For example, eating at the izakaya will grant a scene specific to that person, which gives a deeper look into their personality. In addition, the actual side stories themselves range from good to great. It's one of the best parts of the game, without question. And because of being a people person, the protag is soon granted the role of village chief in each of the 4 settlements, which are the villages of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. This basically entails managing the villages and hopefully bringing people back into them to work and live. A lot of time in the game is going to be dedicated to this village management aspect. You'll be building facilities like housing for the villagers, places of entertainment, decorations, and of course, tilling the land to farm. At first you get a fairly limited area to work with, but as you build more, you'll level up the village so that more people can settle at a time, and more development zones are going to open up. No question, this for me is the best part about the game. So much of my time went to managing the villages and watching them grow, and what was so good about it was that it was always fun, never a chore. I think Guardians of Azuma nailed this aspect. The user interface feels so smooth and easy to work with. For example, when developing new land or buildings and placing them in the zones, it offers an isometric view that makes it a breeze to experience on top of the standard over-the-shoulder perspective. Remember Atelier Yumiya earlier in the year, which also had a construction mechanic, and I said it was the worst part about the game because you could only build it in first-person view? Guardians of Azuma fixed that issue, and it's so much better off for it. What's really cool as well is that you don't need to do all the work yourself. The villagers who come in can be assigned to run shops, farm, mine, chop down trees and fish, and each of them has various specialties, so you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of them by allocating them to the right tasks. You can even move them between villages, though there was an issue where if the populations were maxed out, I wasn't able to simply switch them around. I had to wait till I leveled the village up again, giving me some free space, and only then could I make the change. The general idea though is that as you grow the populations more, you get more output in terms of the vegetables and the ore and all this kind of stuff that you put into your shipping sheds, meaning that you earn more money, which can then be used to construct more buildings and the like. It's a really interesting and satisfying loop. I cannot deny that this was a joyous part of the game. Just walking around the villages and watching the people at work, it's oddly settling to just see it all happen in real time, knowing as well that I was responsible for facilitating all of it, not to mention being free to arrange these villages pretty much however I wanted. I had areas dedicated to trade, others dedicated to farming, some were purely used for housing. It's really fun and flexible to boot. It helps too that the OST overall is really good, with songs that match each of the villages and the general atmosphere of the game. The only real issue with the soundtrack is that it sometimes cuts out without any warning, which I imagine can be patched out. I also really liked the art direction for this game. It's not graphically intense, but this is why for me, art direction is so much more important than just how good the graphics are. Every developer has a vision in mind for what a game is going to be about, and thus you need an art style that complements it. In the case of Guardians of Azuma, if you want a relaxing game, as was the aim, you need a colourful and pleasing art style to match the feel-good nature of the game, and I think it does that really well. Now, when I was eventually able to drag myself away from the village management, I had a host of semi-open world zones to check out, which is where the last part of the game kicks into play: exploration and action-based combat. Guardians of Azuma is a fairly straightforward action RPG. You have a standard combo, equipment management, up to 6 members who can join you, each with their own roles, the ability to equip 2 weapons that you can switch between, a dodge mechanic, and the so-called sacred treasures which grant unique abilities. Each of the treasures has an overworld use too. Each of them can purify blight that afflicts the land, but the fan, for example, allows you to run quicker, or the parasol can be used to glide long distances. It's not much, but it gives a welcome addition to the methods of exploration. As for the quality of the combat, it's good. It's responsive, plenty of options to work with, and the difficulty does ramp up around the middle of the game, though in keeping with the consistent laid-back nature of the game, it never becomes too difficult. The combat itself also enriches further when you dive into the skill trees. You've got trees dedicated to different weapon types, one for each of the sacred treasures, and some dedicated to village management. The more you engage in each area, the more points you're going to be awarded to put into these trees, so maxing out each of them will take a while. And in short, that's pretty much the main offering of Guardians of Azuma. You go out and explore, you manage the villages, you progress the main story, deepen your bonds with the characters, and do so effectively at your own pace. I found myself satisfied with the balance of activities in this game. There was always something that I wanted to do, very little of it felt tedious. And I feel that Guardians of Azuma fulfilled exactly what it set out to do. It was never going to be overly serious, it was never going to be stressful, it was always intended as a laid-back, relaxing JRPG that makes the player feel happy while they play it. That is exactly what it did for me. It had some issues here and there, but in the vast majority, Guardians of Azuma did not disappoint. It's a great game and well worth checking out. The 36th game I played was Shin Megami Tensei Persona, PSP emulated, and I abandoned it after 12 hours. Oh dear, it was going to happen one day. I've played so many great retro games that it was inevitable that eventually I'd find one that didn't match my tastes. I just didn't expect it to be Persona of all things. In short, I found the majority of my time with the first Persona to be tedious. In truth, it's more Shin Megami Tensei in tone and gameplay, which is not an issue. I like SMT as well, but the game had many things within it that I found frustrating. The encounter rate is absurdly high, the dungeon designs are annoying, the negotiating for demon cards is held back by trial and error, the battles, which are frequent, are way too slow, and I found I wasn't engaging with the story or characters. The final nail in the coffin was the remix soundtrack, which didn't match the tone of the game at all. Some may hold it in high regard, but I don't, and I have no intention of going back. The 37th game I played was Tales of Hearts R, Vita emulated, and it took me 42 hours to finish. Yep, it's another Tales game, and I have been on a bit of a binge of this series lately, and for good reason too. There is one word that describes this series, and that is consistency. I know what I'll be getting from a Tales game, and more often than not it will be a positive experience, at least a 7 out of 10. As for Tales of Hearts, a game created for the DS and then later released as Hearts R on the PS Vita, that consistent moniker remains. It was yet another great game, but Hearts R also excelled in areas that even its franchise peers never reached the heights of, which we will be getting into, I assure you, later on. Hearts R begins with two siblings attempting to escape a mechanical witch, and this eventually leads to them jumping into the ocean. The younger sibling, Kohaku, is found by a rookie Soma user named Kor, and later developments lead to Kohaku's Spiria, basically the spirit of the person or their heart, being split into fragments across the world. Feeling responsible for this, Kor vows to find these fragments and restore Kohaku's Spiria. Now, as far as Tales games go, it's a familiar method of storytelling and progression. The group will move across an overmap from town to town and proceed the story in a linear fashion. The story itself is a concept that Tales has done many times before, utilising the power of friendship and bonds to overcome a world-threatening evil. To be honest, I'd be disappointed if that wasn't the premise of a game called Tales of Hearts. Now, while I do think the story starts off a bit slow, it does improve in the later stages, with some poignant developments and well-realised story beats. While it's a familiar premise and tone to other Tales games, it is well told, and from a certain point kept me engaged right to the end. The presentation of that story is also great, with a combination of both standard in-game cutscenes and animated moments for the bigger developments. That being said, the main story of Hearts R is surprisingly short. If I just focused on the narrative here, I could have easily finished it within 25 hours. That could be partly because of technical limitation, considering it was made for a handheld, but it did take me aback how rapidly I was watching the story play out in the latter parts. But when I play a Tales game, I'm well aware that the main story is only scratching the surface. This is a series which is known for having a rich amount of side content, and Hearts R is no different. And quite simply, it's side content done right. The main story gives enough for the narrative and characters to be satisfying, but the side content delves deeper into their individual backstories or gives further context to the world itself. For those who want to discover more about these aspects, they need to seek it out, and I found there was a good balance between humorous side content like the traditional hot spring scenes, and more serious ones like side stories which are introduced in the main story, but are later pushed on via the discretion of the player rather than revisited in the main story because they're not plot essential. I think Heartsar does a good job in distinguishing what is essential to the story while also providing a hook for each of its side stories to incentivize a player to seek the conclusion of each one, like restoring the spirit of a young girl who has been asleep for years. Of course, this side content also yields a bunch of tangible rewards in addition to cutscenes like new equipment, new titles, and naturally, new skits. The skits in particular are very enjoyable in Heartsar, mostly because the characters as a collective are some of the best in the series to date. In short, a lot of them are just mad, and I mean that in the most endearing way possible. It's essentially controlled chaos when they appear on a screen, and the skits just add to that humour, allowing me to visualise what's happening simply from sprite art alone. But the quality of the characters is just right for my tastes. Core is a soft-hearted guy but is a bit of an idiot, Chalcedony is the prim and proper knight wrestling with his inner desires, Kohaku is a frilly princess who actually packs a punch, and Beryl functions as the out-and-out clown. Tropey, sure, but tropes done right. The tropes don't define their characters, they merely become the basis for what they develop into, and each one evolves into their own relatable individual come the end. I also have to give massive props to the chemistry of the group overall. I loved the interaction between them pretty much all the time. It shouldn't surprise people considering this is Tales, but Heartsar has a great bunch of characters. Yet the praise does not end there, not by a long shot, because we haven't even touched on the combat yet. Now it's worth noting that combat between the DS and Vita versions is different. The biggest one is that the DS takes place on a 2D plane, the Vita is fully 3D. And I've made clear in my review of Eternia that I prefer 3D for the freedom and flexibility it gives. Not that there was much choice anyway, as the DS version never released outside Japan, so whatever. Still, what can be said about the combat in Heartsar? Up till now, Grace's F had the best combat, which I also played earlier this year. I feel sorry for that game because its time at the top was very short-lived. In short, Grace's F has amazing combat, but Heartsar is better. Man, the combat in this game absolutely rules. It's the optimal mix of easy to pick up but difficult to master. Heartsar on the surface looks similar to games like Vesperia, but there are some notable mechanics that make it the most satisfying in the series I've experienced to date. In terms of controls, X is your standard attack, circle accesses your art, square is guard, and you can move around with the analog stick. However, Heartsar also brings in the use of the directional pad on the Vita, which will dictate what type of art or attack you use. Press up on the pad and press X, you hit the enemy skyward, and then move on to an aerial combo. It sounds finicky, and it was a bit difficult to get used to at first, but around the 5-hour mark, I found this was the best way of making combat in Tales work. Having movement tied to the analog stick and then mapping the intricate combat to a separate control scheme worked so well, and it felt great to play with. You've also got mechanics like the chase link, which allows you to extend combos by pressing square and teleporting to an enemy location when they're marked. There are chase cross attacks where two characters unleash an attack together. You've got mystic arts and dual mystic arts, and if you press the square button at the right time when an enemy flashes red, you can counter and extend your combo further. Arts are limited by a TP counter similar to Grace's F noted next to the character's portrait, and basically the more of these you have, the more arts you can chain together. So it's all about combining positioning, standard attacks and arts change in order to unleash long-lasting combos. And I was getting well into the hundreds with this system. I could even juggle bosses for days, but it still required input from me to make it happen. It still had that skill expression. And when you have an awesome combat system that is player dependent, you get something extremely fun to work with. It was so good in fact that I mostly didn't care about the high random encounter rate, which is one of the only drawbacks of the game. Even when using holy bottles, you'll still bump into a fair few, a bit of a pain when navigating dungeons, which have a habit of bringing in some very annoying puzzles. But in the majority, I did not mind getting caught in combat here, because it's just so good. I also appreciate that it's quite easy to control the other party members here. You can touch their portrait to activate a chosen ability, and you can directly command them to use certain abilities too, rather than relying on them to activate it at their discretion. As for progression, it's also great. It's a simple approach with the use of the somas, which are basically the weapons of each of the characters, and every time a character levels up they get additional soma points. Those points then get put into a matrix of 5 choices, and that will grant new skills, stat boosts, and of course ever more powerful arts. It's not the deepest progression system, but it's a tangible and satisfying one, and that's all I really want. So overall, Hard SAR has a good story that starts slow but gets better by the end, great characters, a solid amount of meaningful side content, and the best combat in the series. Combine all that together, and you've got one of the best games in the series. Hard SAR is a hidden gem, man. I feel like so many people would miss out on it purely because it's on 2 platforms that many people don't have access to anymore. Heck, if I didn't have a PC and an emulator, I wouldn't be able to play it either. All the more reason for Bamco to get these games to accessible platforms as soon as possible, but I'm glad I did play it, because games like Hard SAR can't be overlooked, especially if you're a fan of Tales. It is fantastic, and well worth checking out if you have the means to do so. The 38th game I played was Quartet, played on PC, and it took me 20 hours to finish. A full review is in the description. Coming from the same team as Shadows of Adam, which was a solid 7 out of 10 indie RPG and well worth its price, all I can say is that Quartet surprised me, in a very good way. For me, it's one of the best turn-based RPGs of 2025. Very fun gameplay, a decent story with a strong group of characters, good pacing, and very little bloat during the playtime. Quartet is a must-play game for any fan of turn-based RPGs. You should definitely make some time in your backlog to check it out. The 39th game I played was Lunar Eternal Blue, played on PC, and it took 31 hours to finish. Now, after playing Silver Star Story, I had to fire up Eternal Blue soon after. The first game left such a good impression on me, and I was hoping that the sequel would do the same. And it did, man. It did. Honestly, there's not much for me to say about Eternal Blue after my earlier comments on Silver Star Story, because it's so similar to Silver Star Story in many ways, but that is not a bad thing. In fact, I was hoping that it was similar, as I just wanted more of the comforting feeling that the first game gave me, and Eternal Blue picked right up where the first game left off. It's set around 1,000 years after the first game, and is centered around the journey of Hero and his Draco companion Ruby as they work together to aid Lucia, who is descended from the Blue Star. She is on a mission to thwart the plans of the evil god Zophar, who was once responsible for the destruction of the Blue Star. Now, in terms of gameplay, there's little to say about Eternal Blue. Pretty much everything I said about SSS applies here. It's got a notably linear structure as the story progresses, fantastic animated cutscenes which only add positively to the experience, it uses the same style of turn-based combat with up to 5 party members in addition to traditional leveling up and equipment management. It's pretty much the same game, but like I say, I've got no issue with that at all. The only real problems I had with Eternal Blue were mostly minor. Stuff like dungeons being a bit too long, especially in the second half of the game, having to consistently tap the run button instead of just having a toggle option became a bit grating, and the biggest problem for me is that sometimes I couldn't see whether an ability hit an enemy weakness. The menus would kind of get in the way. Basically, when you hover over an enemy, it will give you an indication as to its effectiveness. A red cross means it won't be effective, a green circle means it will be. However, I found that sometimes those menus would block that symbol, so I couldn't actually tell what was effective and what wasn't until I attacked. Minor, but it was the biggest issue I had with the game. However, I will say that Eternal Blue improved on my main issue with the first game, which is the inventory management. It felt far more simple to work with, as it provided an option for a solid coloured box while navigating shopping menus so they no longer blend in with the background. That's a change I was happy to see. But just like the first game, it's well paced on the gameplay side. I didn't feel the need to grind at all during my playthrough, and there were plenty of new abilities opening up for each character over the course of the journey at a good rate. So really the only thing that sets Eternal Blue apart from Silver Star Story is the story and characters. And it had big shoes to fill because I loved these aspects in the first game. As for Eternal Blue, I love the story and characters in this game too. The characters are new, but as charming as they were before, brought to life further through those brilliant animated cutscenes. They develop well, each with their own individual story that often ties into the main plot. The music is brilliant, and I did like the story in Eternal Blue especially. With how it often connected back to Silver Star's story, it built upon the mythos of that first game, especially in regards to the history of the Blue Star. Not to mention, there were plenty of callbacks to characters from the first game, and they're not just treated as references. Even though they're long gone come Eternal Blue, their roles are still given importance in the context of this story. The one thing that Eternal Blue does have that is unique from Silver Star's story, however, is its epilogue, which adds a good 5 to 10 hours after the main story concludes. This not only leads to the eventual true ending, but also gives free rein to explore the world, while also offering a decent array of optional dungeons and side quests, and I'd say it's worth doing. I mean, I loved the offerings of the main story so much, of course I would jump at the chance to play more of it. And that's all I really need to say about Eternal Blue. It's so similar to the first game, but I'm happy that it was. Why attempt to fix something that isn't broken in the first place? And it makes it all the sweeter that the two games are available in one bundle nowadays, making it so easy to experience them back to back. Simply put, I cannot split the two games in terms of quality. They are as good as each other, and both are fantastic JRPGs as a standalone anyway. I am very happy that I got the chance to play them. The 40th game I played was the Final Fantasy II Pixel Remaster, played on PC, and it took 14 hours to finish. I'm slowly making my way through these. I'm in no rush to play the Pixel Remasters, and I'm basically firing them up in between other games that are higher priority on my backlog. At the end of the day, I don't have any nostalgia for them, and I'm going in fresh to each one, so at the very least, I can see the changes of mechanics over time and how Final Fantasy evolved over the years. And while Final Fantasy I felt like a traditional JRPG experience, Final Fantasy II was anything but. It's an interesting game, not bad per se, but experimental is the word I'd use. Now, of course, playing the Pixel Remastered version, I'm well aware there were quality of life improvements over the original, but for the sake of attempting to play it as close to the original experience as possible, I didn't want to use any of the XP boosts or random encounter toggles until I hit around the 7-hour mark, just like I did with Final Fantasy I. In this way, I'm able to at least comprehend what it may have been like back in the day and judge it based on that merit. Come that 7-hour mark, I was thankful to be using some of those features. I'm pretty sure that if I wasn't playing the Pixel Remastered version of Final Fantasy II, I wouldn't have liked it, nor would I have pushed through to finish the game. Simply put, there's a lot in Final Fantasy II that annoys me as a player, though the story isn't one of them. Unlike the first game, Final Fantasy II is not based around 4 Warriors of Light. Instead, it begins with an invasion by an empire who forces the current monarchy to escape. The remnants of this monarchy bring together a rebellion to one day take back their kingdom, which is where we find our characters, who have also escaped the bloodshed and then pledged themselves to the cause. Out of personal preference, I much prefer story premises like these. While I can appreciate the simple approach of chosen hero beats the darkness, I do prefer the more grounded nature of warring kingdoms. No doubt Final Fantasy II does steer into the concept of defeating some otherworldly deity later on, but it's mostly centered around the retaking of the kingdom. As for how that story plays out, it's fine. Like I said with Final Fantasy I, I'm not expecting some groundbreaking story here, just a serviceable one. And Final Fantasy II falls within that bracket. A lot of the developments are snappy, I would even go so far as to say contrived at times, but it's an older Final Fantasy. It came out in the late 80s, I'm not expecting anything grand here. Still, I liked how most of that story played out, shallow as it may be. And there are some neat ideas here and there. For one, characters can learn keywords from NPCs, and those terms become the fulcrum for pushing the story forward. Choose the right options when you talk to them, and you can proceed. The real difference comes in combat though. While the turn-based style is still there and the threat of status ailments is as potent as it was in the first game, I was immediately surprised that the 4th member, who was named by me before starting the game, wasn't part of the team. In fact, that 4th slot rotates for pretty much the entire runtime, which if I'm being honest, I'm not a fan of. No doubt it aids in the developments of some side characters who join the main party, but I would have preferred having that 4th member with me at all times, especially when considering the leveling system, which we will touch on right now. because there is no traditional leveling up. Instead, the characters have levels tied to individual weapons and parameters like strength, intelligence and HP, which also increase individually. The general idea is the more you use something, the better it becomes. So hit things with your sword often enough, your sword skill goes up, and whether you gain experience will be determined by the rank of the creature you're fighting. In short, it felt like I was playing a saga game, which is cool. I've only played 2 of these myself, but I enjoyed both, and when I realised that Kawazu worked on Final Fantasy II before developing Saga later on, it all made sense. This was the progenitor for the Saga series. And in some ways, I did like it even in this early form. I'm a fan of the individual skill system. I like this idea that the characters don't have defined roles, they essentially mould around the choices of the player. Do I want a typical warrior, a dual-wielding berserker, a dedicated healer, a mage? Final Fantasy II allowed me to choose whatever I wanted. And for a game that came out so long ago, I appreciate the creativity. I don't think it's perfect by any stretch. The very nature of the system can lead to lopsided character progression, which can make some bosses a test in patience if you don't have the right skills, but this form of progression does resonate with me. My one real gripe with Final Fantasy II's leveling is that it also applies to spells. The only way these level up is by using them, and naturally, you'll be using some spells more than others. For example, Cure will be used a lot more than Life, so you'll get powerful healing abilities relatively quickly, but your resurrection spells will remain pretty naff unless you're willingly letting team members die. I do think this system of progression was improved massively in the Saga games, especially Revenge of the 7 Years Later, but to see it in its early state was very cool. Though there's no doubt that the Pixel Remaster made it easier to work with. Come that 7-hour mark, I did turn on boosts to give me 2 times the experience, simply because it did get slow at the later ranks. And that's not the only feature I was compelled to use, I had to turn off random encounters. The encounter rate in this game is much like Persona 1, it is horrific. 5 to 10 steps before hitting a fight, and coupled with some dire dungeon design which has a bunch of dead ends made it even more egregious. If I didn't have the option to turn off those encounters, I would have dropped Final Fantasy II, no question. Saying that, I don't want to come down too much on this game though. Sure, the encounter rate is rough and the dungeons are devil spawn, but it came out at a time when Final Fantasy was still in its infancy, when JRPGs were still in their infancy even. There were only 2 Final Fantasies at that time, this and the first game, so it only makes sense that there were some ideas here that didn't hit the mark. This was the time for experimentation. Heck, even Zelda had exactly the same growing pains with The Adventure of Link. There were some technical issues with the Pixel Remaster too. I got some bugs here and there, like this misaligned shadow that pops up after using the airship, which could only be fixed by restarting the game, but no more than minor problems with the port, nothing in the realm of hard crashes at least. I no doubt had issues with Final Fantasy II, both on the technical and gameplay sides, but for 14 hours, I'm content. I do want to play these early games with no preconceptions of what might be waiting for me. At the end of the day, the only one I'm aware of in terms of quality is Final Fantasy VI, so I'll continue to slowly make my way through, and despite my issues with Final Fantasy II, I am glad I got around to playing it at the very least. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.